Welcome everyone to this week's podcast. My name is Martin Empson and I'm a socialist in the UK, and I'm the editor of the new book System Change, Not Climate Change. We're very excited this week because we've got Caitlin, who's a socialist in Australia, based in Sydney, an activist with the Solidarity organisation. And Caitlin's going to be talking to us today about the bushfires, the response of the Australian government, and what's been happening there in terms of the climate movement and the trade unions. So, Caitlin, thank you very much for joining us and taking your time out to be part of this podcast. Can you, firstly, I suppose before I start, I should offer my solidarity from socialists and trade unionists in the UK to what looks like an appalling environmental crisis over there. Can you give us a bit of a sense of what's been happening over the last few months and how people have been impacted by the bushfires?
Yeah, sure. I suppose people will have seen, a lot of the quite apocalyptic-looking images coming out of Australia from some of the worst affected areas, like the particularly along the east coast of Victoria and the south coast of New South Wales. Truly sort of horrifying images of skies glowing red and orange. But so at this point, we've had about 11 million hectares of bush burnt, 27 deaths so far. 5 of those have been firefighters. About over 2,000 homes destroyed. 500 million animals killed. Another 500 million displaced or wounded. We've got sort of insurance losses standing at sort of around $1 billion. And actually the fire season is not even over. There's actually a few weeks to go, and it could get worse in some places. And the fire season itself actually started about 3 months earlier than usual in 2019. So the stage was set for a very bad season early on. Even if we haven't been immediately affected by the fires, it's been sort of virtually inescapable, really, because in the biggest cities, in Melbourne, Sydney, Canberra, our cities have been absolutely covered in smoke for sort of days at a time. At some points, we've had the highest rates of pollution in the world. That was the case in Canberra earlier this week. It's been, extraordinarily difficult, particularly for people who have to work outdoors, schools being closed and the rest of it. This is, really probably the first real climate crisis that Australia has seen on this kind of scale. And it really has to be said that, it has to be put down to the changing climate. So last year in Australia was the highest temperatures on record, the lowest level of rainfall, and those records were only breaking the records that were set in the 3 or 4 years previous to that. So Australia has always had bushfires. Of various sizes, but nothing of this size ever before. And we've got landscapes burning that have never burnt before. So sort of moist rainforests that were that haven't burnt and probably now won't recover as a result of the fires, because there are other areas in Australia that are much more capable of coming back from bushfire because they're bushfire adapted, but some of these ecosystems won't recover, and it's being said that we've already effectively lost entire species as a result of the fires. And of course, it's been ordinary people that have borne the brunt of the damage from the fires. So this really is very much a class issue, even in the immediate sense. The firefighters themselves, obviously, most of whom are volunteer firefighters, but in the cities and the surrounding suburbs, they are professional firefighters as well. The thousands of people who have had their homes destroyed, entire towns incinerated, And as I said, the people who have been working outside in these in the terrible smoke pollution, who have been sort of forced to continue to work through those conditions. And I mean, through all of this, we've also had heat waves in some places. So in Western Sydney, for example, the temperatures reached around 48 degrees Celsius earlier this week. And in some of those places, I mean, at the moment we're on holidays, but when temperatures reach that height during school times, it's virtually impossible to continue to function. A lot of our public schools don't even have any air conditioning, so you can imagine kind of working in that heat. So I mean, underlying all this has been the drought conditions, and we've had towns that have been without water for months on end, particularly in Western New South Wales, and towns actually running out of water during the fire crisis, which has been horrific as well. So it's been a very scary summer indeed, and quite. Everyone has been affected in some way, whether they've been immediately affected, they've been, had to be evacuated from places, or, people essentially being kind of hemmed in to the city, particularly in Sydney, by being surrounded by fires, not able to really take their hard-earned holidays and the rest of it. So it's affected just about everyone.
I suppose the images we've seen over here from the UK are pretty shocking, but I think people are also quite shocked by the response of the government. I mean, your Prime Minister Scott Morrison puts our Boris Johnson to shame in terms of his inability to connect with ordinary people. But it's not just a one-off, is it? The Australian government has a long record of climate denial, of cutting funding to public services, including the fire service and so on. Can you tell us a bit more about Scott Morrison, about how people have reacted to him, and really the roots of the crisis from that side?
Well, the coalition government in Australia, which is made up of Scott Morrison's Liberal Party and the National Party, have a very long history of essentially being climate deniers, and also have been going to great lengths to deny the connection between the fires and the change in the climate. And there's been warnings for years about how bad the fire season was going to get as a result of climate change. But to give some context, I suppose, about the Liberal government's climate denialism, it has a lot to do with the fact that the fossil fuel industry is so incredibly powerful in Australia. I mean, I know it is around the world, but I think it's particularly the case in Australia. The mining industry is enormously powerful, particularly in coal exports. We exported about $26 billion worth of coal last year alone. They want to export more and more and open up more mines. We've got around 75% of Australia's energy comes from coal, so it's really, really hardwired into the Australian economy. And over the question of the fires, the Liberal Party has really been sort of tearing itself to bits over the question of the climate. Morrison has been sort of trying to. Initially, he was trying to deny any connection with climate change, but he's still trying to talk down that connection. And people might have seen the interview on the BBC with a Liberal MP called Craig Kelly, who founded the Parliamentary Friends of Coal, who was outright trying to outright deny the connection with climate change at all. And that is really despite the fact that consistently around 80% of people in Australia sort of believe the science around climate change. We've had a government since 2013 that has done everything that it can, essentially, to prevent any real action on climate change. And I suppose in terms of the direct response to the fires, Scott Morrison himself, the Prime Minister, has copped a lot of criticism about his response to the fires, and particularly the fact that in December during the height of the crisis, he decided to take a holiday to Hawaii with his family, and was uncontactable for a lot of that time. And at the same time, the emergency services minister decided to take a trip to Europe. So he's been really, he's copped a lot of criticism, sort of left, right, and centre for his response around that, and he's been trying to do all sorts of strange things, like he launched the cricket season in the middle of all this, and talked about the fact that firefighters would be inspired by the Australian cricket team's efforts on the field, which is it just proves just how incredibly out of touch he is. And he was also going for luxury dinners with the Murdochs, the media family, amidst all of that. And during the recent international climate talks in Madrid, Australia, the Australian government basically tried to sabotage talks there, and tried to make the argument that they should be able to carry over credits from the Kyoto Protocol in order to be able to recalculate their emissions and be able to continue to emit more. And we're already considered as one of the furthest off track in meeting our Paris climate targets amongst the developed economies in the world. We've got the second highest emissions intensive energy sector amongst the G20 countries. So yeah, this is the kind of context that we're dealing with in terms of this very much being a climate crisis, but the government going to great lengths to deny that fact, essentially. But you also asked about the cuts. The cuts to public services that have really compounded the whole situation. There has been, a lot of these cuts have actually happened on a state level. So most of the fire services are run by the state and territory governments in Australia. So in New South Wales, the state that Sydney's in, there have been years and years of cuts to the fire services. The Fire Brigade Union claims around $12 million was cut in the last budget. That is a contested amount, but there has been widespread calls for many years for actually increased funding to the fire services around the country that have gone unheeded, both by the Commonwealth Government and the state governments. And there's also been a kind of ongoing battle between the fire brigade, the professional firefighters, and the volunteer fire services, which has really played out to quite disastrous effects during this crisis, because a lot of the fires, the vast majority of the fires, have been fought by volunteer services as opposed to professional firefighters who are actually employed and paid a wage and so forth. And there's been calls for the volunteer firefighters to be compensated, because some of them have been working for sort of months on end now in some places, going without their wages, spending time away from their families and the rest of it. And the Morrison government finally kind of had to fold on that about a month ago, when he announced that firefighters will be able to claim up to $6,000 worth of compensation but from the reports I'm hearing, that's been made very difficult for them to claim. And on top of that, there's also been huge cuts to the Parks and Wildlife Services. There was a statement released by the Public Service Association, which covers public service workers in New South Wales, saying that the state government slashed the number of park rangers from 289 to 201 between over the last 8 years. And these are the people who are supposed to be carrying out land management and the rest of it, and essentially keeping an eye on the land and having an idea of how much sort of fuel there is in the forest and the rest of it. They also, the National Parks and Wildlife Services, which is on a national level, had their budget cut by 121 million a couple of years ago as well. And underlying all this has also been a water crisis. So parts of Australia have been in drought for years. But we've had entire rivers dry up. We've had towns that have been out of water for over a year now. And some of the worst affected have been Aboriginal communities in Western New South Wales. But despite all of that, the mines in those areas and cotton, things like cotton farms and other industrial farms have been able to buy credits to actually buy up water, and have been using that water that is no longer available to towns for drinking water to run their mining operations. So yeah, it really is this crisis really is a sort of perfect storm of climate change and neoliberalism coming together, really.
Yeah, I mean, it does sound a classic example of profit being put entirely before people, but it also sounds like the government itself has no answers to the crisis and almost couldn't solve it even if they want to, which I suppose brings me onto the movement there, because one of the things that's been really inspiring here in the UK has been the scale of the climate movement over the last few years in Australia, both as in terms of the climate strikes and wider protest movements, which have been really, really huge. What's the response been? I saw video of some of the demonstrations on Friday in Australia. There was demands for climate jobs and system change and so on. How is the climate movement, the trade union movement, responding to the bushfires and to the government?
So on Friday we had some really excellent, enormous rallies around Australia. I think there was about 20,000 in Sydney alone, but there were marches in virtually every city in the country. But there were also similarly sized marches in December last year as the scale of the pollution crisis was unfolding, particularly in Sydney. We had sort of days and days of smoke coming over the city. But the most recent rallies on Friday were specifically calling to sack ScoMo, which is what we call Scott Morrison, and to fund fully fund the fire services and to pay volunteers. And that you could just see that the anger and the fear that people had amongst them was just absolutely palpable after the sort of horror summer that we've had. But I think even though the rallies themselves were primarily calling to immediately sack Scott Morrison and fund this fire services, it was also very much about climate. There were a lot of chants about climate action, the need to switch to renewables for a just transition, and the rest of it. Unfortunately, in these most recent rallies, they've been called quite quickly, and there hasn't been an enormous organised union response, but there has been union representatives on the platform. There was someone from the Fire Brigades Union that spoke at the Sydney rally and talked about the kind of conditions that firefighters are facing, and the need, the crying need for more permanent resources for the fire services. And I was also pleased to see that in my hometown of Newcastle, which is near the one of the biggest coal mining regions in Australia, the CFMEU, which is the union that covers construction, forestry, mining, and energy, had a representative speaking at the rally there on Friday, and he made quite an explicit call for just transition for fossil fuel workers, which is particularly important in that region, and that's really something that we have been pushing for as our organisation, Solidarity, is for the question of climate jobs, green jobs, to be at the forefront of the movement. And that is sort of slowly becoming, making its way further and further into the movement, I think. And I think that was evidenced during the last climate strike on September 20. It was really fantastic here in Australia. We had some of the biggest rallies since the Iraq War protests. So we had about 100,000 in Sydney alone, and there was much greater participation of unions and workplaces there than there was the last time, and that included my union at the time, which is the NTU, which covers university staff, which a lot of the universities themselves actually shut down for the day, and didn't shut down, but a lot of thousands of students and staff actually walked out to join the climate strikes that day. But I think what was really significant as well is that since the earlier high school strike for climate in March last year, the high school strikers in Australia had added a demand around a just transition and green jobs, and I think that meant that unions were much more willing to be involved in the movement, and so you saw a much greater, much higher participation from unions from the construction sector. We had an electrical trade union speaker up on the stage talking about the need for massive public investment in renewable energy. The Maritime Union of Australia also spoke on that platform. They were out on strike that day, but it has also, there's a lot of debates going on, I suppose, about the way forward, because the question of, or the demand for climate action could mean any number of things, really. And for many, many years, we've had successive governments in Australia trying to put forward all sorts of market mechanisms and other ways that sort of don't get at the core of the problem, essentially, and don't effectively cut carbon emissions. And they've also we had a previous Labor government try to introduce a carbon tax that would actually pass on the cost of pollution to consumers rather than putting it on polluters. So that's the sort of background to the movement here. So one of the main things, as I said, that we have been pushing is around this question of climate jobs, and we've been quite involved in setting up a group called Workers for Climate Action that was initially set up to spread the strikes, the high school strikes, into workplaces, which we had some success with, but we've now formed an ongoing group out of that, which is quite exciting. We're also calling for 100% public renewables by 2030, because in Australia the energy system is a bit of a patchwork quilt of privately owned enterprises. It's impossible to essentially oversee the transition to renewables that we need unless it's in public hands. And of course, no more fossil fuel projects. And the Liberal government is actually talking about extending the lifetime of some of these old, some of them 40, 50, 60 years old coal-fired power stations. They're actually trying to extend their life at the moment. But just to wrap up that point, I suppose we had our last federal election in May last year, and at that time, virtually everyone thought that the Labor Party was on track to win government, but the Liberal Party ended up getting back in, and that was largely they actually campaigned on the back of the continuation of the coal industry, and around the question, sort of campaigned around the question of jobs in the coal industry, and that they weren't going to end coal mining. And unfortunately, the Labor Party had sort of equivocated over the question of whether or not it was going to support new coal mines, because wanted to sort of play it both ways. But instead of sort of putting forward a positive vision of what a post-coal Australia or economy could look like, they came across as not essentially not caring about jobs, and I think that made an enormous impact on their electoral failure over during the election. It was sort of telling that the areas, the Hunter Valley, and areas in Queensland, which are almost entirely dependent on fossil fuel industries, massively swung away from the Labor Party in the last election. And so I think this question of jobs really needs to be at the forefront of the movement.
That's really interesting, because I think one of the things we've argued here in the UK, the campaign against climate change, is 1 million climate jobs has always been put the question of just transition central to it, and the idea that workers shouldn't lose out as part of a transition, a move to a zero carbon economy. So it's really interesting to hear that that's starting to get a bit of a grip, because it's very interesting that trade unions, for instance, just before Christmas, I remember I think you mentioned the Maritime Union, some of its members going on strike over the conditions they were having to work in with the smoke, but actually moving from a sort of defensive to a more positive alternative view, I think is a key question for the movement, and something I think we need to argue for. I was very interested reading Naomi Klein's latest book On Fire, which is all about the debates around the Green New Deal. She makes the point that unless the Green New Deal offers something to working class communities and also challenges the very basis of capitalism, the drive to profit and accumulation, it's not really a positive. It's not going to make the difference that's required. What do you think the prospects for getting starting to win real victories over this are? I mean, is it likely that, for instance, the Scott Morrison government will be defeated over the bushfires? He seems quite badly damaged. Do you think the trade unions will start to take climate change seriously on a big scale? What are the prospects going forward?
Well, I guess I'll start with the question of the unions, and particularly the MUA, and then move on to prospects for getting rid of the Morrison government. Well, yeah, just on the MUA, the Maritime Union of Australia, I think another thing that this crisis has really, another question that it has raised is the question of the right to strike in Australia, which is massively curtailed. We really only have the legal right to strike within very, very constrained circumstances, and this has brought that to the fore again, because of course as I said before, there's been people having to work outdoors during these days of terrible terrible smoke pollution, and during that time, a number of workplaces actually refused to work with the support of their unions. They they downed tools and said, we're not going to work under these conditions. And the first to do that was the Maritime Union of Australia, which is one of the most militant unions here, particularly in Sydney. And so they actually, the workers who were working outside decided that they were going to stop working from 3 p.m. That day, and a number of other workplaces followed with the support of their unions. And even though there is actually a law that says that workers are allowed to stop working under immediately unsafe conditions, the employers in those workplaces still attack the unions for actually acting on that. And I think it is telling that it was actually only workplaces that already had existing strong union organisation that were able to actually take action on that. Otherwise, you might have seen sort of maybe one worker or a group of workers here or there deciding not to work, but it was the places where they were organised that actually took action. But it has really raised the question of winning back the right to strike, which Solidarity has been quite involved in pushing over the last few years through a campaign around winning back the right to strike, because it's becoming very clear that if we're to win any serious action on climate change, we're going to need to not just call for a just transition for workers, but actually to mobilise workers around that demand, and to actually use our power as our collective power as workers to actually bring the system to a halt. But at the moment, we are the unions in Australia are so hamstrung by the anti-strike laws that it makes it extraordinarily difficult to take strike action, even over immediate sort of bread and butter issues, let alone broader issues like climate and so on. But moving on to the Morrison government at the moment. I mean, the government is very divided over the question. Scott Morrison has faced criticism even from representatives in his own party, particularly in New South Wales, where the Liberal Party are also in government at a state level. The Young Liberals have come out and said that there needs to be an admission of the connection with climate change. So they are quite sort of divided over the issue. But as I said, there's a very, very powerful right wing to the Liberal Party that really has been calling the shots so far. And in terms of the prospects for actually getting rid of the Morrison government immediately, and I mean, I wish I could say those prospects were more real right now. I do think that there is a need to sort of generalise the anger towards Scott Morrison himself to be to the rest of the Liberal Party, really, and their mates that own the mines and coal-fired power stations all over Australia. Unfortunately, the Labor Party, having drawn what I think are all the wrong conclusions from their loss at the last election, have also been very unwilling to talk about climate amidst the crisis. They have been, sort of going quite hard on the Liberal Party over the question of lack of funding and support for the fire and rescue efforts, but they've really gone mostly quiet over the question of climate. They're saying that there is still a role for the coal industry to play in the Australian economy. They're continuing to try to play it both ways, even though there is an enormous appetite, particularly amongst the Labor base, to have a real policy on climate that would see more jobs. But and there's also unfortunately been an absence of the Greens, who are the basically what are known as the environmental party in Australia, have sort of been largely silent over the last couple of months. So in a way, there is a very big political space for the climate movement to take up at the moment, and I think there are very real prospects for that becoming a mass movement over the next few months. Whether or not we can immediately get rid of the Morrison government is another question. I really hope that we do get to that point sooner rather than later. But absolutely, this crisis has done some pretty serious damage to Scott Morrison. He has clawed back a little bit of ground by now agreeing to give the fire services virtually anything that they want. He's after years of ignoring what the fire chiefs have been saying about needing more equipment, about the fire seasons becoming catastrophically bad and the rest of it, he has now, agreed to give more money for aerial firefighting resources. He also brought in the army to assist with the evacuation efforts. Brought out the reserve army for the first time in many years. I mean, the question of whether the army should be the institution responding to climate crises is another issue. But yeah, I think at the moment he may have clawed back a little bit of ground. But I think the task for the climate movement, such as it is at the moment, is really to pin this crisis to the government and to their climate denialism. And I think we really need to make sure that this is, not just the start of, increasingly bad fire seasons, but the start of a movement that can, make serious changes to the system that we live in.
Changing tack slightly, one of the things that we've argued in the socialist movement around climate change is the way that climate change itself will exacerbate other divisions in society. And I've seen over the years that the Australian government, rather than the Australian people, have had a terrible record in terms of the question of refugees and so on. And I know your organisation has been very involved in solidarity with the refugees. I'm just wondering if you've got stuff to say about the impact of climate change, both in terms of racism within society, but also in terms of the Aboriginal people. I saw a report, I think in The Guardian just before Christmas, about the way the consistent, extremely high temperatures have been driving Aboriginal people out of their traditional home areas and territories and so on. But I suppose also we will start to see internal refugees in Australia. And I wondered if you had anything to say about the sorts of movements around anti-racism, refugee solidarity, and Aboriginal rights and so
on. Yeah, well, the impact of the fires has, of course, been the worst on the poorest communities in Australia, and particularly on Aboriginal people. As I said, some Aboriginal communities have been out of water for over a year now, relying on charities to actually bring drinking water all the way from Sydney, in order to be able to continue to actually keep those towns alive. There's been various smaller Aboriginal communities that have been devastated by the fires themselves. So, example, there's this small town called Mogo in East Gippsland, which is where some of the worst fires have been in Victoria in recent weeks. That town Mogo has been pretty much decimated by the fires, but also the effects of the fires are really compounded in situations of poverty. So in a lot of Aboriginal towns like in Mogo, there's problems with overcrowding in houses, and so once one house burns down, around 15 people can become homeless because there's a lot of people living in those houses. And of course, there is also the what you can imagine is enormously deep grief at seeing seeing your traditional lands being incinerated. People are watching their traditional lands burn, even in places where they've never burnt on this continent. And it has raised questions around. I mean, I'm sure you've heard the questions being talked about around land management. Of course, Indigenous people in Australia manage the land here effectively for tens of thousands of years, and have a lot to contribute, I think, in terms of knowledge and understanding of how various ecosystems in Australia work. And I think the climate movement does need to take up some of the demands of Aboriginal communities around the need for funding for Aboriginal people to be employed in parks and wildlife services, to be involved in the efforts to manage land effectively. So yeah, that is certainly that's certainly been a part of the crisis as well. I mean, on the question of refugees, it's I mean, the Australian government spends billions of dollars every year keeping out refugees. Billions of dollars that could, I mean, not only go to simply housing, helping refugees become established in our communities here in Australia, but those billions of dollars could also go to, buying more resources for the fire services. For example, there's been, I don't have the figures in front of me, but there's been so many $1 million spent every week to keep one single Tamil family on Christmas Island, which is an island that used to be an offshore processing centre, but it was closed down years ago. They reopened it last year just to keep this Tamil family that they were trying to deport back to Sri Lanka. They've been keeping them there alone on Christmas Island, spending millions and millions of dollars doing that. So I think that's that just shows where the government's priorities lie, and just how invested they are, I suppose, in policing and militarizing Australia's borders. And I think it's significant as well that some of the laws that have been used against climate activists in recent months were actually introduced under anti-terror legislation that was targeting Muslims, that has been rolled out over the last 20 or so years. Those laws are now being used to actually target climate activists who have been protesting against new coal mines at various coal summits and the rest of it. And there's also the issue of Australian imperialism in the Pacific. The coalition government has ignored repeated pleas by leaders of Pacific Island nations to cut our emissions. Places like Tuvalu, Tonga, Vanuatu. The island nations and nations in the Pacific are literally going underwater and have been calling on the Australian government to take serious action on climate change, and they've just been absolutely ignored, and in some cases actually sort of scorned and made fun of by members of our government, which just shows you their attitude to smaller nations in the Pacific. And I think the Australian state has really considered the Pacific to be its backyard for a long time, and I think that's the worst evidence of that would be the infamous offshore processing centres for refugees in Papua New Guinea and on Nauru, where there continues to be asylum seekers and refugees languishing. There was a 2011 Defence White Paper released about climate change in 2011 that essentially said that Australian Defence Forces would need to ramp up their presence across the Pacific in response to the social crises that will inevitably result from a changing climate. So that's, I mean, even though we say that we have a government full of climate denialists, they very much know they're not actually in denial. They know that it's coming. They know that it's there, and the military is in its own way preparing for it. And I mean, I just finished with one anecdote that I found quite telling. So a comrade of ours was holidaying on the south coast of New South Wales when the catastrophic fires hit that area, and he said, during that time, while he was kind of stuck there, one of the only pieces of climate-related graffiti he saw was said "Climate action, nuke." Climate action, nuke China now. Essentially, suggesting that China was responsible for climate change, and there really has been a massive ramping up of anti-Chinese racism in Australia over the last few years, as tensions have been building between Australia and China over the South China Sea. And of course, Australia has a long-standing alliance with the US and has been very much giving its support to the US in the trade wars and so on. So yes, there is massively an overlap of racism and the climate crisis in Australia today.
Thank you. I think just to wrap up, really, that 2020 will be almost certainly a year of climate protest. I know we've got here in the UK, and I'm sure internationally too, climate strikes scheduled in February the 14th, Valentine's Day. Love the planet, I think is the slogan, and March the 13th. But there's also a global day of action, days of action around April the 3rd. I'm sure that will be happening over there, and we're building here in the UK towards the United Nations next climate summit, which is taking place in Glasgow in Scotland at the end of 2020, and we're looking towards big mobilisations for those events and elsewhere. And of course there'll be, I'm sure, protests around racism and so on as these issues come apparent. Are there any events that you want to highlight coming up in Australia that you're mobilising for? What are the next steps of the movement?
Well, the next big thing in Australia is going to be February 22, a National Day of Action around climate. This has been called by a new kind of alliance, I suppose, that we've been involved in, sort of trying to coordinate here in Sydney, of different groups that are active around environment and the climate. We've called a rally for February 22. So we're hoping to get massive numbers to that. I believe that something will be called on that date in Melbourne, but I don't think it's confirmed yet. As for the high school strikes, I'm not sure whether the high school students in Australia have agreed yet to do theirs on the same day as the Northern Hemisphere. But I'm sure there'll be a huge call out when that does happen. But in the meantime, there's all sorts of organisations that people can get involved with. In Sydney in particular, I think Workers for Climate Action is a really great place to come to for anyone who wants to, start sort of mobilising their workplace around the question of climate. There's going to be a lot to do in coming months. It's set to be a really big year of campaigning around climate here, I think.
Thank you very much, Caitlin. Thank you for taking time out to talk to us today. It's been an absolutely fascinating, if scary, and inspiring interview. So thank you for your time today, and best of luck with the 2020 struggles and bringing together the climate and workers' movements. As we say here, system change, not climate change. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for for listening. If you'd like to read more, you can find up-to-date articles at socialistworker.co.uk. If you enjoyed what you heard and would like to join the Socialist Workers' Party or find out more about us, you can go to swp.org.uk. If you'd like to get in touch, you can find us on facebook.com/Socialist Workers' Party, on Twitter @SWP Britain, Instagram is socialist_workers_party, and you can subscribe to our podcast on all major podcast sites, including Spotify, Deezer, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Spreaker and iTunes.